Hello, we're live, it seems. My name is Nathan Martin, and I'm the head of marketing at Off to Class. And if you're joining us right now, you'll be joining us in a few seconds as all the streams come online. We're super pleased that you're able to join this last webinar event for the inaugural ESL Career Week. And I can't think of a better way to end the week than the person that we're going to have joining us, Daniela Torre Gibney from Bellwether Education Partners. But before I introduce Daniela and her just kind of a perfect pedigree to talk about kind of what states and districts could do to improve their ESL and bilingual teachers pipeline, I just wanted to say thank you to all the team and all the people that have worked so hard this week to make this happen. It's been a lot of coordination. My colleague Sarah, who hosted the session yesterday, and we're really hopeful. We've seen a bunch of teachers, a bunch of districts get involved with this, and we're really hopeful that this will actually be helpful and be useful, not just for this week, but in the weeks to come. So wanted to kind of acknowledge that. Today, we're going to be talking about how states and districts can improve their teacher pipelines. We know that bridging this sort of shortage or like improving this teacher shortage is not just about sort of hosting a webinar or having a jobs board. It takes sort of serious policy and practice. And there are a few organizations more serious, more thoughtful about education policy in the US than Bellwether Education Partners. It's a group that I've been aware of for a long time, have a lot of respect for. They're a nonprofit that occupies a really important centrist position in US education policy. And Daniela is a wonderful addition to the team, a senior associate partner in the policy and evaluation unit. She's a former ESL teacher. Who focuses on this sort of area and looks at how schools can improve, particularly for multilingual learners and marginalized students. Her family is originally from Argentina, where my wife's family comes from, which is an awesome sort of background and lens to add to this conversation. And we had a great chat before this, and the sort of insights and things that she's been studying could add a lot to this. And so I'm just going to get out of the way, turn it over to Daniela. And if you have any questions, I know we have a great Facebook community of teachers. Feel free to chime in. Daniela may address them during this session or later, but feel free to add comments and we'll address them and try to engage with them. So I'm going to step out and hand it over to Daniela. Thank you so much.
Thank you for that, Nathan. Thanks for introducing me and for inviting me to talk to folks today about how to build a stronger ESL and bilingual teacher pipeline. And thank you all for joining. It's really humbling for me to be able to talk to practitioners and folks in the field who are doing the hard work of supporting these students every day, and hope that we can learn a little bit today together and hear thoughts that resonate with you or might spark ideas for how you might do this work in your districts. While you're here, please introduce yourself. If you can, share your name, your role, and your location in the chat. That'll just help us all know who's here and who's participating and what kind of expertise you all bring to the table. Okay, so just a brief overview of our agenda today. I'll take a few minutes to introduce myself, give a little bit more detail. We'll spend some time defining ELs, who our population is that we're talking about. We'll talk a little bit about why these students need specialized educators to support them in schools. We'll talk a little bit about the bilingual ESL teacher shortage nationally, as well as policies to mitigate those shortages, and then spend the last couple minutes just in closing. So again, please participate via chat. This is going to be a lot of me talking, and it'll help me know that you all are engaged and learning something or understand the questions you have if you put the comments in the chat. And hopefully you all can learn from each other at the same time. I'll go ahead and kick us off. So Nathan gave a little bit of introduction to me, but I wanted to spend a little bit more time on how I came to this work. So like Nathan said, my family and myself were from Argentina. So I moved here when I was 2 years old. So I was an EL, an English learner. I learned English in school exclusively. But I never in my memory that I can remember had any specialized teachers or was in any specialized program to teach me English. It was more a sink or swim approach, which worked out okay, I think, given that I started school in English. But what I regret about my education was it was what a really wonderful researcher named Angela Valenzuela calls subtractive schooling. So what that means is my Spanish language and my Argentine identity were never seen as an asset. And then because of that, I grew up hiding that language, not using it in school, not connecting it to the things I was learning in school, and my culture as well. And I think that we know better nowadays, and we can do better for the students in our schools. So part of that is why I come to this work and am passionate about helping schools and teachers support the English learners in our classroom. I also spent 5 years working as an ESL bilingual and general education teacher. So worked in elementary schools, worked in bilingual settings, and then doing pull-out ESL at the time, and then worked just in a general ed setting and kind of saw how it works and how different models work. And the skills that I needed and maybe didn't have was really present with me at all times. When I decided to go to graduate school, I focused on how schools and teachers could best support English learners. So really focused on how the setting in which English learners learn can impact their achievement and what teachers bring that can help English learners succeed. And since then, I've been doing, for the last 7 years, really focused on evaluating educational programs and conducting research in schools, always bringing in that lens of how any educational program might be addressing or not addressing the needs of English learners in classrooms. I think we all know that English learners are in all of our classrooms, and so any educational program needs to attend to this population. Okay, so I also want to mention where I'm at now. I'm a senior associate partner at Bellwether Education. We're a national nonprofit focused on dramatically changing education and life outcomes for systemically marginalized youth and their communities. And so we work with a lot of partners across the country, both on a variety of topics, including helping them build a stronger teacher pipeline. So we work with residency programs, foundations, nonprofit organizations, school districts, et cetera, to help them think about how they can improve teacher pipelines. And we also have a distinct strand of work that's focused on supporting organizations in supporting special student populations. And those populations include ELs, but also include students who have interrupted education for a variety of reasons, including because of homelessness or experience with the judicial system. So that's a big focus of our work and something that we engage with lots of folks about. So before we get started, I want to spend some time just talking about who we're talking about, who the English learner population is. I recognize that you all are here because you work and care about students learning English, and that what I might talk about might be familiar to you, but I do want to take the time to honor the diversity of the EL group of students and think about how that diversity impacts the ways teachers teach these students and how districts have to support these students. So first, let's just talk about language. How do we refer to students learning English at schools? I'm sure you're familiar with the kind of ever-changing best terms for these populations. When I was teaching many, many years ago, it was common to use the terms limited English proficient student or language minority student. But since those years, those terms have fallen out of favor and are not really looked well upon because they're deficit focused. It focuses on what the student doesn't know rather than what the student does know and is bringing to the table. So other deficit focused terms are English learner, which is it's what I'll use today. It's what's used by the federal government. It's probably most typical in most districts. but is still really focused on what they don't know, instead of what they do know. More asset-focused language includes multilingual learners, dual language learner, which is typically used for students in the 0 to 5 years of age range, language learner, or emergent bilingual, which is my favorite because it really recognizes that students come with a whole other language system in their head and are soon to be bilinguals. And so I want to just sit on this for a second and recognize that this quote here, that by looking at children through a monolingual, monoglossic lens, we perpetuate educational inequities and squander valuable linguistic resources. So I know that that's not what any of us intend to do, and so we want to be intentional with our language. In the chat, if you can, I'd love to hear what term is most common in your district, how that's changed over time, and what it means for students and families. I definitely noticed changes in the language, but wondering if that is apparent on the ground. I'm going to go ahead and move forward, but I'm kind of monitoring the chat, but hoping you guys can kind of answer each other's questions as I go. ELs, or English learners, are commonly grouped with other student populations, but there are big differences in these populations. I think most commonly, when a lot of folks think of English learners, they think, oh, those are my Latino students or my Latinx students, or those are my immigrant students. But actually, the vast majority of ELs are born in the US, so are not first generation immigrants. They might be second generation immigrants. And while most ELs are Latinx students, depending on where you are, it's not a perfect overlap. Also important to say that most Latinx students are not ELs, so it's not an overlap that's perfect. And again, many students who are immigrants or speak another language at home are also not ELs. One thing I think is really important to note is that ELs are the fastest growing subgroup in the United States. So they have grown, the population of ELs has grown tremendously in the last 20 years. Today, there's around 5 million ELs across the nation, which is about 10% of the K-12 public school student population. That means that the methods and practices and policies that were designed in the early 2000s may or may not be relevant now, and we need to think about our approaches differently than we used to. But ELs are not dispersed evenly across the country. So traditionally and currently, most ELs and their families are concentrated geographically. So these two graphs show the top where most ELs live. Over 75% of ELs live in 5 states. So California, Texas, Arizona, Nevada, et cetera. And we call these traditional destination states. I think when we're thinking about why this is important, I think about these states having the particular experiences, resources, and assets to really serve the needs of ELs really well. And there's a lot to learn from how they are serving ELs and what has and has not worked for them. Something I'm really interested in is that in the last 20 years, the population of ELs has expanded and become more dispersed. So whereas traditionally, most ELs lived in these states we just talked about, like California, Texas, Florida, the last 20 years, we've seen a lot of growth in places like South Carolina or Georgia, where I live in Atlanta, or North Carolina, or through the Midwest. And so you'll see in this map, we see states that have over a 400% increase. And if you take this down to the district level, it might even be 1,000% increase. While these increases are really big in percentages, that might still mean that there's a small population in these places, but that doesn't mean the schools don't have to do something. So we all know that schools are mandated to support ELs, and so whether the population is big or small, there's that mandate there. I think what's interesting about this is in traditional and in new immigrant destinations, there may not be the same depth of experience around how to teach ELs, and so a little bit more work on the teacher and the school to figure out how they're going to meet the needs of these students. Like I was just talking about, in traditional and new destination areas, there are low incidence and high incidence districts. So a low incidence district would mean there's less than 5% of ELs. These districts educate less than 10% of the ELs across the country. So there's not a lot of ELs there, and they account for a few ELs, but they still have the mandate to support these students well. But they may not have the resources or experience to do so appropriately. High incidence districts are going to be places like Los Angeles or places, big urban centers for the most part. They have a population of greater than or equal to 20% of ELs, and they educate most of the ELs across the country. I've done work in both high incidence districts and low incidence districts, and I think some of the challenges and opportunities that are faced in these districts are similar. But in many cases, the low incidence districts struggle with the resources they need to do the work to support ELs adequately. In the chat, if you want, you can talk about whether you are in a low or high incidence district and what the unique challenges or opportunities related to the concentration of ELs are in your district. And thank you all for those who are participating in the chat. Want to flag that in new destinations we were just talking about, ELs are more likely to be part of low-income families, be first or second generation immigrants, and be undocumented. They may also be more likely to attend schools outside of urban centers and have more access to resources, including credentialed teachers. So it's in terms of where they're positioned, it really depends on the school and the setting they land in. Schools in low incidence and new destinations typically have less resources. They may not have established the curricula or assessment programs and policies to support ELs, and they may not have that experience. So those are some of the obstacles that these places face. But often they may have a different resiliency or different networks and a tighter community that they can leverage to support ELs. Whether or not a district is low or high incidence or in a new or traditional destination, schools across the nation struggle to find credentialed ESL and bilingual teachers, develop strong homeschool relationships, and support ELs. This is a nationwide issue, and so something all schools need to learn about, attend to, and try to do better in. Finally, I wanted to talk about the diversity of English learners. As I'm sure you all know, English learners are a diverse bunch. They differ in terms of the languages they use at home, their generational status, so whether they're first generation, meaning they immigrated themselves, second generation, meaning their parents immigrated, or a term that I like because it applies to me is what's called the 1.5 generation. So someone who came when they were young and has done the majority of their schooling in the US, and how that generational status impacts the trajectories of students and the supports they have. The reasons they immigrated, so they may have come, their parents may have come for work, they may have come for work, or they may have come as a refugee or an asylee, or they may have come for family connections. So there's lots of different reasons people immigrate, and that makes a difference in terms of the family and community that EL has to draw from. Their immigration status, their socioeconomic status, their parent education, and when they came to this country. So I came when I was 2, and my brother came when he was 4, and even we had very different school experiences of learning English. And I think that applies for all of our ELs. There's also a lot of recognized subgroups in the EL population. So these are subgroups that kind of come with definitions from the federal government or state governments. And typically, when we think about educating ELs, there might be specific programs for these subgroups. So that includes migrant students, students who move around a lot. They might be following work throughout the year. Newcomer students, so those are students who have come to the US in the last couple of years. Long-term English learners, typically those are defined as students who have been learning English or classified as an English learners for 6 or more years, students with limited or interrupted formal education, English learner students with disabilities, and reclassified and former ELs. I think it's really important to keep all this diversity in mind. I think outcomes for these students are really different. The way we approach teaching these students can be really different. And the expertise teachers need to support all these students is really different. So in the chat, you can describe the diversity of ELs in your district and what opportunities and challenges exist in your context. Okay, so I'm going to dive in now to just a brief overview about the need for specialized educators to support ELs. So this will be just a brief overview. So there have been many policies since immigrants and folks learning English have been in the United States. There have been policies to address how these students should be educated. So in the 1800s, there were lots of laws passed sanctioning schools to teach lots of European languages, in particular German or Polish. But there are also guidelines and policies that prohibited the teaching of other non-English languages, especially Native American languages and Spanish. So today, federal laws grounded in a few important federal Supreme Court decisions. Some of the more important ones are Plyer versus Doe, which gives access to undocumented students to a free public education. Castaneda versus Picard, which set out a series of requirements for what schools and districts are obligated to do for their English learner students. And the federal guidance is also influenced by legislation like No Child Left Behind and ESSA. So I won't go into all the details around those, but I think the big takeaways are here. Programs must be educationally sound. That means that they need to be sound in theory and effective in practice. The programs must support language and content proficiency in a reasonable bound of time. And so that focus on not just language, but also that ELs can access content, grade level content. Programs must be available until ELs are proficient. So until they're reclassified, they should be given support. English learners with disabilities need to be provided the appropriate support, both to meet their language needs and to meet their the needs that the supports they need to address their disability. Undocumented students are entitled to a public education. Schools and districts are obliged to provide translation, both when parents and students are at the school, but also in written materials. And when students enter a school, an age-appropriate grade placement is required, instead of perhaps placing an older child into a younger grade because their English language proficiency is low. The educationally sound provision, is one that's really important for the policy context in related to instructional programs across the country. So on this map, you'll see a lot of blue states. The blue states are ones that require that districts adopt an educationally sound program. And those include bilingual programs. In most cases, they include bilingual programs. In all cases, they include ESL or English language development programs. In just 4 states, there's a requirement, in just 7 states, there's a requirement that bilingual education be offered to English learners. Only Washington State requires it for all English learners, but 6 states require bilingual education if the district reaches a particular threshold. So that might be 20 students of the same language in a grade or district. But often these states allow waivers if there are a few ELs or teacher shortages, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And only 1 state mandates English only currently. And so all of these states are within the same guidelines, but some choose to prioritize different instructional programs, which require different teacher skills. Like I was saying, there are different instructional models, and they're more or less appropriate for different student populations, and they require teachers to have different types of skills. So I just highlight big buckets here. English, ESL, or ELD programs focus on language more than content, and they're offered in English with little use of an EL's primary language. Structured English immersion includes programs like SIOP or SEDI, and they really focus on providing appropriate scaffolds to English learners so that they can access content. And they're also usually primarily in English with little use of the EL's primary language. The next two I have here are transitional bilingual education and dual language. And I saw some chat around different types of program. Typically, I think of a transitional bilingual education program as one that's specifically for English learners. And the focus is on using the home language as a scaffold for students until they're proficient in English. That's a little bit different than dual immersion programs, where it's really designed for all students, native English speakers and English learners, to become proficient in two languages. And so they'll be learning English and another language. So all educators working with ELs need specific training in pedagogy, content, and cultural competence. Here are just some examples of the knowledge and skills that researchers have kind of convened upon that say that teachers of English learners need to have. They include linguistics, so how English is structured and used, how students learn a second language, that process, and how teachers support that process, sociocultural theory, which is how language is used as a tool for social interaction, cultural competence to engage with students and their families that are from different backgrounds, as well as knowledge of the language development standards that are applicable in a particular state. They also need to bring lots of skills, so how to differentiate instruction, how to create and adapt assessments, how to communicate and how to with different stakeholders, and how to collaborate. I think this last one around how to collaborate is particularly important. Many times ESL or bilingual teachers are collaborating directly with non-ESL teachers to support these students. And so there needs to be structures and methods in place for how to make that collaboration productive. I'm recalling now some rather unproductive relationships that I had while I was an ESL teacher, and I think having had more support around this would have been helpful for me. Teachers also should be familiar with the instructional methods backed by current research. So these methods are kind of separate from a particular program model, but high quality programs will use one or more of these methods. So that's using the primary language, taking time to build background knowledge or schema, designing worthy tasks and meaty questions. So really getting kids engaged that way in authentic learning tasks. Providing engaging and supportive materials. And these should be high interest for ELs at different proficiencies and ages. So those high interest, low reading level materials are often important. Creating time, space, and scaffolds for constructive interactions and conversations. So really focusing on supporting students' oral language development is something that's really important. Integrating oral and written language into content area teaching, so giving ELs lots of practice with oral and written language, and teaching vocabulary intensely across lots of days to build that vocabulary knowledge. There's also some research around characteristics of teachers that are related to their effectiveness. Some of these are the same that you would see in effectiveness for teachers overall. And when I say effectiveness, I mean their ability to improve student achievement on standardized achievement tests. But specifically for EL teachers, we see experience teaching ELs in the past matters. Sometimes having an ESL or bilingual credential matters. A desire to teach EL, so that motivation matters for how effective they are. And I think that's really important. Speaking the home language of the ELs being taught is really important. And then having specific strategies or program training. So there's evidence that folks who get PSYOP training are more effective teaching ELs than those who do not. This is a body of research that's pretty nascent, so it's a mixed bag, but I think that it's enough to say that it does matter that folks want to be doing the job and have some experience and training to do so. One thing that I think is really important is that most teachers will teach an EL over the course of their career. Nowadays, we don't typically put ELs in a class by themselves, and the ESL teacher is the only one teaching them. ELs are integrated in our schools, and so most teachers will have this experience. And so most teachers should have some pre or in-service training around how to support these students. Research has shown that teachers with and without formal training report that they are underprepared to teach ELs, and teachers receive little professional training around this topic. And so I think, as district leaders, it's an area of focus that really is important wherever you are, so that everyone is prepared to teach these students. And a last note on this, a study in 2013, so a little dated, but I think still applicable, showed that most teacher prep programs don't offer specific degrees in teaching ELs, and less than half require even a single class on educating culturally and linguistically diverse teaching. Not all states require that teachers obtain a special credential, and only 20 states require that mainstream teachers take any courses related to teaching linguistically diverse students. So to me, there's a glaring gap in the way that we prepare our educators to teach ELs, even in states where there's some sort of requirement. I did a lot of research in North Carolina, and I remember being astounded that only 2% of the teachers in North Carolina had an ESL credential, and that meant that most of the ELs in the state were not being taught by an ESL credentialed teacher. So I think that's something to think about in terms of how the requirements we want for the teachers who are teaching this population. My question for the chat is, one thing I heard a lot when I was teaching was that good ESL teaching is good teaching for everyone. And I'm wondering if you agree or disagree with that statement, and whether you think the opposite is true, that good teaching is good for everyone is good ESL teaching. And if you could share the skills or knowledge that have been most important for ESL and bilingual teachers to have, in your opinion. Okay, so I'm going to dive into some information about bilingual and ESL teacher shortages. I'm sure we've all read the news and are feeling this now. But the shortages in specialized ESL and bilingual teachers are really persistent and common. So there's a lot of headlines now, especially because of the pandemic, but actually these shortages have been around for as long as people have been reporting shortages. So it's a continued shortage that has not been ameliorated in most places. The official statistics show that there's a shortage in at least 32 states in ESL or bilingual educators, and that doesn't include shortages in paraprofessionals or other support staff that support these students as well. And we know, again, that these shortages might be worse because of the pandemic. So research describes at least 3 big buckets for addressing shortages, and this is shortages in general. And also applies to ESL and bilingual teacher shortages. Jacqueline, I see your comment about Canada, and that's it's interesting to see the differences in how Canada and the United States approaches certification requirements. She says that in Canada, everyone needs to be certified, or you cannot teach ESL. Oh, thank you. That's quite different here. As you know, in the United States, we don't have federal policies that mandate certification policies, and so there's just guidelines. So going back to some approaches for addressing shortages, the big buckets here are to strengthen the teacher pipeline, which is really increasing the number of people who enter the teaching profession and decreasing the number of folks who leave it. providing financial incentives, so that's attracting teachers to hard to staff areas, and improving working conditions. So there's a pretty robust body of research about teacher turnover and what causes teacher turnover and teacher attrition. And far and away, money and salaries and benefits and working conditions always come up as a reason that folks are leaving. And so that's something to keep in mind. So I want to just dig in a little bit here. So some policies and programs to strengthen the teacher pipeline include grow your own programs. So those are ones that draw on existing community assets to strengthen the teacher pipeline. So it typically means that a district is recruiting teachers or folks in the who are already in the education system. So it could be a paraprofessional or a student intern or maybe high school students in the area, recruiting those folks who already live in the area and have a connection to the schools into the teaching profession. So an example of this is the Logan Square Neighborhood Association in Chicago that works with public schools to identify paraprofessionals and train them and get them ready to teach in Logan Square elementary schools. The reason that this is an effective practice is that it taps into community resources. It's really asset-based, but it also, the folks who are living there are probably not going to leave. You know, a lot of times we think about other models that recruit from outside. Those folks who come from a different state or district might be transient, whereas folks who already live in a district are more likely to stay and be retained. Residency programs provide educators with the support that they need to be successful on day one and stay in the classroom. So residencies typically require teachers to be in a clinical placement for an entire year. They're there with a mentor teacher, co-teaching with a mentor teacher all year long. And so in the research I've done on teacher residencies, principals usually say the residents who come when they become first-year teachers, it feels like they're already second-year teachers. They don't struggle as much with classroom management. They understand how the school works. They have a better time collaborating with the veteran teachers in the school. And so it really helps prepare them to be really effective from the beginning. And that not only gets more teachers in the door, but also can lead to reduced attrition because the new teachers are not as overwhelmed by the first year of teaching. I can tell you now, I was not in a residency program. I did an alternative teaching certificate, and I was completely overwhelmed on day one. And I'm surprised I made it through day 5, but I did, but it was very tough. I would have appreciated a residency program. Finally, induction and mentorship programs support new teachers as they begin their real-world practice. So typically, this is in the teacher's first, second, and third year. They might be assigned a mentor or a different induction professional development. An example of this is a new teacher center, and it works with schools and districts across the country to support teachers. And their programs have shown positive impacts on teacher practice and teacher retention. And so just having someone that a new teacher can go to helps to reduce attrition and reduce burnout. So I think we all know that salaries, benefits, and financial incentives are really important to keeping people in the classroom. I wanted to highlight, I recently helped conduct a survey in the Kansas City metro area, and by far, at least twice as often as other categories, people said improving salary and benefits would be something that would improve their plan or make them more likely to stay in their position for a long time. So I think it's good and bad news. I think a lot of times we want to think of what we can do to support teachers, and when it comes down to it, what teachers and educators want is an increased salary. And then to improve working conditions, for ESL teachers specifically and bilingual teachers, we want to think about providing sufficient resources, allowing for teacher collaboration and autonomy, and providing training for everyone in the building is really important. For resources, I think this is especially important for for both ESL and bilingual teachers. I remember when I worked in a bilingual setting, we didn't have resources. I remember very clearly, I would write out worksheets and in Spanish, and I would send them to my dad to proofread for me because I needed to create most of my own content. And that was hugely stressful and time consuming, and something that really impacted my ability to stay in that position. I would say too, for providing training for leaders and all staff, ESL and bilingual teachers want to know that everyone in the school see educating ELs as their responsibility. Some research has shown that ESL and bilingual teachers feel isolated and siloed. They feel like they're not treated as professionals, and people discount their expertise. And so being brought into the fold of schools can help them feel a little bit less stressed and feel more engaged with the school, and more productive with the work that they're doing. Okay. Now, quickly talk about additional considerations for districts who are facing a shortage of bilingual educators. Districts should kind of think about identifying the community assets. So what populations might be positioned to succeed in bilingual and ESL roles, and what types of support do those populations need. So in the Logan Circle program in Chicago, they identified paraprofessionals as folks who already had the language and education skills to be effective as bilingual ESL teachers, but they needed a little bit more training. And so thinking through who's already there and can be tapped is really important. Exploring external sources is also important. So thinking about what are the advantages and disadvantages to recruiting from other states, territories, or nations, and how can you leverage the existing networks to do so. Doing a needs assessment is really important. So understanding who are the ELs in your district. We talked about the diversity of this population at the front. So thinking about all those lines of difference and how the teachers you recruit can best assist in the ELs that you have. And finally, establishing partnerships. So working with IHEs to build residencies that really fill the gaps in your district, and finding other partners to provide induction support or provide additional monetary support is all really important. So in the chat, if you want to answer if there's a bilingual or ESL teacher shortage in your district, and if so, what are the needs you currently have and what strategies have been successful? It'll be helpful for others to maybe hear what's worked or what hasn't worked in your district. Okay, I'm going to dive in again to some more policies related specifically to bilingual education. 2 years ago, I worked with some colleagues on a series of briefs specific around bilingual education, and so I want to highlight what we learned there. I think a lot of the findings here are applicable to ESL teachers as well, but some of them less than others. Okay, so I think the main thing to point out is that there's a tension between having really rigorous requirements for certification on the one hand for our bilingual educators and having the need and demand for a lot of bilingual teachers right now. And so when districts are thinking about whether to offer bilingual programs or how to offer them, and then what they want to require from their teachers, they need to balance those two things so that we have high quality teachers in front of students teaching them in bilingual programs. And so that's just something that's always a tension. And when we think about how we can change policies, we always want to think, are we maintaining high quality, a bar for high quality so that our students who are learning English and our vulnerable population are getting what they need? So I'm going to talk about a few policies that can be flexible to address bilingual educator shortages. So first, providing multiple pathways to certification. Second, offering a menu of certification requirements, ways to meet certification requirements, allowing probationary certification, and allowing waivers. I'll talk a little bit about each one in turn. So the first one here is being flexible around how teachers earn their base teacher credential and their bilingual endorsement, and allowing that to happen at the same time. And so here's just a simple kind of checklist about how you might be more flexible. So you want to ask yourself, does a candidate already have the base teaching certification, like a K-12, maybe an elementary certification or a single subject certification or a special education certification, whatever it may be? If they do, then they could be eligible for an add-on bilingual certification, where a teacher completes a concentrated sequence of courses and meets a fieldwork requirement in order to get that bilingual endorsement, but it might be at night or on weekends. It's something they can do while they're teaching in the field with their base certification. If they don't already have a base teaching certification, then you can think about having teacher candidates complete a simultaneous traditional certification where they're essentially earning their bilingual certification and their base certification at the same time. Or they might do an alternative certification. And that might be like a bilingual teacher residency or a certification program where a teacher works as a bilingual teacher or a teacher of record or intern while they're doing their credential. So that allows them to do school and be in the classroom at the same time. Another way to be more flexible is just to make requirements for the certification, provide more flexibility around that. So the first one is around certification coursework and content requirements. So in some places, folks need to complete a certification program at a local IHE, and they need to pass a certification test. So that might be like the praxis test or another state certification test. In some places, there's flexibility to do one or the other. So if you can demonstrate your competency through passing the test, you don't necessarily need to complete the entire certification program. So in California, candidates applying for a bilingual certificate need to do either demonstrate that they have completed all their coursework or pass the portions of the California subject examination for teachers. This can work for both folks who, there's a lot of times passing tests is a barrier for teachers entering the field. And so it's somewhere where in the teacher pipeline, it's a leak. People pass all their courses, they do well in their program, and they can never pass the certification test. And so they're not able to become teachers of record. And so allowing this flexibility allows more teacher to get into the program. Flexibility can also be in language proficiency exams that are required. Not all states or districts require a language proficiency exam, but in some places, the state has one exam that they give, and folks need to pass that. In other states, like Massachusetts, there's multiple options, and so they can like in Massachusetts, they can get a passing score on the test, the oral proficiency interview and writing test, or a more traditional sit-down multiple choice test. And so there's different ways for them to show their language proficiency. Finally, in terms of coursework options, traditional requirement would be there's one prescribed course of study. This is in a lot of states. They say you need to have a class in X, Y, and Z. But a more flexible requirement would be to allow folks to build a series of courses that could have been taken at different points in time or in different programs that address a key set of knowledge and skills, but may have just not occurred at the same time. Next, another way that folks address teacher shortages is to allow multiple certification options for teachers who have experience working with ELs. And so this might be allowing a probationary certification or emergency certification to teachers who are working on their ESL endorsement or have it, but who haven't finished every single last piece of it. And so some examples here are in Illinois. They provide preliminary certificates for candidates who have 9 credit hours towards certification or have passed their content test but haven't finished all the requirements that they need to teach. And so they have 3 years to finish that. And in California, they offer an emergency 1-year bilingual credential to candidates who are completing their bilingual credential and showing progress, but who haven't finished it. And so they can get into the building while they're still in school. This is actually used very frequently, and there are pros and cons to these approaches. I've worked with districts in California where, a majority of their ESL and bilingual staff are emergency credentialed. And in an ideal world, we would want to see folks with a lot of experience, a mix of folks, new teachers as well as veteran teachers who have more experience and expertise. But when faced with shortages, it's one solution to that problem. Another thing that can provide relief for shortages is to import teachers from other states or other countries who can fill the gaps. The way that works is through reciprocity policies. So those are the policies that dictate what people need to demonstrate when they come from out of state or from different countries before they're allowed to teach in the school. And they vary really widely. Stricter policies may or may not mean that there's a higher bar for quality, but it does make it more difficult for teachers to fill positions. So just some examples here of the policies that 3 different states have: Massachusetts, New Mexico, and New York. In Massachusetts, all the candidate would need to show that they've completed a bilingual prep program and provide a transcript. That's not the case for New Mexico and New York. All of these states require that folks demonstrate they have a master's or bachelor's degree. But in New York, they also have to have reached a 2.5 GPA in their highest degree earned. So that might limit who can apply for reciprocity. In New Mexico and New York, they have to provide a current and valid teaching license. So for folks who may have left teaching for many years, this could be really difficult to produce and would maybe derail them from this process. New Mexico and New York also require certain years of experience in the classroom before they will grant reciprocity. Again, that might hinder students or teachers who just graduated from going into a different state. New Mexico requires that their teachers who are doing reciprocity pass teacher exams. And so, like we talked about, teacher exams are a big hurdle for a lot of teachers. And so that just adds an additional large hurdle for those teachers in filling shortage areas. And in New York, the teachers need to have demonstrated a highly effective and effective evaluation rating in wherever they're coming from. Again, just adding another layer of requirement that could make the process more difficult. Finally, I want to just talk about waivers for bilingual programming and educator requirements. So many districts around the country allow waivers for districts to in how they provide ESL or bilingual education because of teacher shortages. So commonly, in places where bilingual education is a program or required, the waivers allow districts to provide ESL instead of bilingual ed. And so that's an English dominant approach instead of offering education in the English and the native language. And they might employ teachers with an ESL credential instead of a bilingual credential. And so that actually is how I came into teaching. I was in a bilingual setting. I didn't have a bilingual credential, but I had an ESL credential, and that was sufficient for the school. I don't know that it was the best preparation for me. I think teaching in a bilingual setting is quite different. When districts apply for waivers, they typically need to demonstrate a rationale about how they will meet students' needs. So they need to show how they are trying to hire more folks that will be working on bilingual education, and how they will support students in their native language while they're in an ESL or English-only program. And finally, district shortages, it's not just, they're really nuanced, and this goes back to the need to do a needs assessment. It could be that folks don't have the right credentials. They have ESL credentials instead of bilingual credentials, for example. It could be that there are a lot of bilingual teachers, but not in the target language that we need. So there's a lot of folks who speak Spanish, but not a lot of folks who speak Vietnamese, which is a large group in that district. Or it could be that there's a lot of bilingual educators, but not in the particular grade or subject area. So we have a lot of bilingual elementary school teachers, but not a lot of bilingual high school chemistry teachers. And so all of those shortages would be addressed in slightly different ways, but could be addressed through waivers. So if you can in the chat, just what policies help or hinder the ability for schools in your district to hire bilingual staff? Would love to hear that. And that is all the content I have for you all today. I hope that some of this was new and helped you understand the landscape of policies that impact shortages across the country. And if in your mind or in the chat, you can share what resonated with you, anything you learned, or what lingering questions you have.
Thanks so much, Daniela. We really, really appreciate you giving us. I feel like I've just I've had sort of a 101 or maybe a 201 course in sort of understanding sort of some of these teacher shortages and education policy in the U.S. There were two things that sort of resonated with me. I know we had some good comments. Jacqueline actually works with some of the newcomers programs to Canada. So how do you educate people and get them up to speed? And so it was good to see that perspective. I saw Maggie, who actually presented yesterday from Bridge. And so we had a number of people who were joining the comment section. And then I'm sure we'll have quite a few people watching later, as it is of Friday, and it's a busy time. There were two things that resonated with me. One was the bit that you said about how educating ELs needs to be a priority for everyone. This is not just sort of a separate area. And that plus that chart that you had showing just the astronomical growth in ELs as a demographic in the U.S. I'm originally from Mississippi, and that was one of those states that was in dark blue. That feels like a culture and sort of a larger shift that's going to have to happen in U.S. education policy.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, it was probably always the case that everyone needed to be responsible for educating ELs, but definitely now more than ever. And just this idea that everyone is an EL, a teacher of ELs, is just something that I think really sits with me and should shape how districts approach how they support teachers in the field. It's not just for a siloed group of teachers, it's really for everyone to make sure that students are supported and that they're integrated well in the classrooms and they're bringing all the assets that they bring and sharing that with the other students.
And I thought that illustration of you having your father, if I understood right, review your sort of coursework and things to make sure that, like, proofreading and make sure it was right. That sort of isolation and silo, like it is amazing that you're still working in the field and you didn't get burnt out at a young place. And so thinking about how we can support teachers, I think it'd be really critical. We're running up the end of time, but I was just curious if there's one state that's particularly accommodating off the top of your head to teachers who might be, some of our teachers are from an online setting or do a good job of bringing teachers in. You had some of these reciprocity requirements that makes it difficult for teachers to come in. Are there any states that are doing a really good job of making inroads for teachers to come in and get plugged into the pipeline quickly?
Yeah, it's hard to say that there are specific states that are really blowing it out of the water.
Right.
I should say that places to look to are the places that that require bilingual education in some capacity. So places that come to mind to me are Washington State. They really have a robust kind of policy around supporting ELs that's really asset-based. New York State is another one. Texas also does a lot of work, and California does a lot of work in this area because they educate so many ELs. They've just been thinking about it for a long time. And so they just have a lot of experience doing that. So that's definitely where I would start looking. And I'm happy to share if folks reach out, or maybe you've shared already some of the briefs that we've put together around these issues that highlight specific policies in New York and Washington State. So that's a good place to look. But I also think that, like a lot of things in the US, because so much of education is local, that it's more districts are oftentimes doing great work, even if their state is not. And so it may be that they're in a state where the state policy isn't so, I don't know, it's not as developed, but they're really taking it for themselves.
that's kind of the beauty and the challenge of the American educational system. You get the benefits and the challenges of both those things. I just wanted to say thank you so much. We're going to condense this. We'll put this into a blog at some point. We'll make sure to include those briefs and things for our teacher community and our district community. But this is super informative and super helpful. Like it's hard to sort of explain how much you've covered and how helpful this is in terms of providing a research-based foundation. And so I'm sure that our audience, both now, but more importantly, going forward, will find this super useful. I'd encourage people to check out Bellwether Education, follow Daniela and some of her work. She's done some great work already, and we'll be doing some ahead. We'll be in touch for those who have registered with some of the links to these sessions, links to the research. But I would just want to close and sort of say that vision of where every teacher is an EL teacher, every teacher sort of sees that as part of their priorities, something I think we can all strive towards it. Daniela, thank you so much for giving us your time today.
Thank you. And thanks everyone else. Have a great day.
You too.